Perform basic vSphere troubleshooting. You know, every so often, even the very best of vSphere environments sometimes has problems. And, well, when those problems do occur, there are some troubleshooting activities that you have to do. What's interesting about vSphere is, I think I've mentioned it a number of times, that vSphere itself it's an appliance. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the very worst of vSphere problems, in many cases, may not even require any troubleshooting at all. And the reason for this is the fact that, well, at this point, we've already laid down this nice high availability infrastructure. We've got virtual machines that are moving around. They're leaving this host and they're moving over to that host. And so if you have a really big or a really bad problem with a vSphere server, well, there's an argument that the best tactic is just to simply rebuild the server. And there are tools and techniques to do that. And as you've seen in installing ESXi, the process to actually do an ESXi installation is relatively simple. But even with that realization, there are some situations where troubleshooting does need to occur. And a lot of these troubleshooting issues occur when the problem is probably not the ESX host itself. It may be something at the vCenter layer, or maybe you have a configuration that's incorrectly configured on one of the hosts. The long and short of it is that the troubleshooting requirements that you have for vSphere and for ESX are much, much, much easier than they used to be in any of the previous versions. In this nugget, we're going to talk about what some of those troubleshooting guidelines are. If you are taking the exam, the troubleshooting activities or the troubleshooting requirements for the exam are relatively heavy, surprisingly heavy, in fact. And I want to just point you to a document where you can go and review all of the suggested things to do based off of what experiences you're having in terms of problems. Then what I want to do is focus in on a few of the specific features, a few of the specific things that you can work with inside of vCenter that'll assist you with the troubleshooting process. Some of those are going to be in ESXi, others of those are going to be in vCenter, and so the combination of the two presents you with just some useful things you can go to in order to find out what's going wrong. Now, this is not intended to be comprehensive by any means. In fact, throughout the entirety of this series, we've kind of talked a little bit about all the different wizards and all the different screens and all the different control panels that are available to you for controlling and for managing your vCenter environment. Those same control panels and features are the same ones that you'll use in certain circumstances for doing the troubleshooting activities as well. For example, the Performance tab in dealing with performance issues, and the Virtual Machines tab for dealing with configurations and what assigned resources there are. There are a couple of them, however, that we haven't taken a look at yet that I want to show you. The first is which is this DRS resource distribution graph, and also the target and current host load standard deviation. Both of these are important for DRS. And then as it relates to vMotion, there's one more map, just to kind of finish out all the fun maps, that you might want to take a look at here called a vMotion resource map, which will give you some idea about where a virtual machine lies and where it could potentially lie as well. Now, before we get there, however, what I want to do is just kind of illustrate this vSphere troubleshooting guide that you can pick up at vmware.com. This is one of their guides that they've released, and they keep this guide updated. And I point you to this guide as opposed to attempting to try to go through all of these troubleshooting items one by one, because the guide does an excellent job of outlining really what are the biggest issues inside of vCenter and ESX, and then, well, what would you do? What steps would you take in order to figure out why it is behaving in a certain way? They align here with virtual machines and hosts and clusters and storage. Now, down here, if we take a look at just some specifics here, you can see that for any particular problem, this guide, at least in my mind, does an excellent job of outlining, well, okay, what is the master problem here? Virtual machines with large memory are preventing the use of fault tolerance. What may be the cause, and then specifically, what may be the solution in order to resolve that issue? So if you are having problems with just the behaviors inside of your vCenter environment, this document can do an excellent job of helping you trace down, well, what the problem is, and then maybe what a potential resolution will be for that problem. There are, as I said, a couple of specific things, however, that I want to focus on here, both on the ESX side and on the vSphere side. Now, on the ESX side here are these system logs and troubleshooting mode options that present a way for you to, at the console of the ESXi server, take a look at what the logs are, and then also enable some troubleshooting mode functionality so that you can dig into what I've called the Linux portion of ESXi. Let's take a look at what those things look like here. I'm going to minimize this. This is our vSphere client. We've been using this throughout the entirety of this series. However, this is not actually where I want to start. Where I want to start is, in fact, here on the ESXi host. Now, we haven't been here for a fairly long period of time. We haven't actually taken a look at this, these screens for a while, but we have to go back here. I'm going to hit the F2 button here and log on with my root username and password, because here inside of the ESXi console is where you can find that information. Down here at the bottom are first the system logs that are available to you. And you'll see here on the right that we have a number of different system logs that we can peer through to try to figure out what's going on. Now, these can be somewhat challenging for you if you're not used to how the Linux OS and how VMware actually goes about putting information in its logs. For example, if I want to go view the VM kernel log here, I just hit the number 2, and then that pops up a whole big old long list of all the entries that the VM kernel has dropped into its log. There are a couple of keystrokes you just want to be aware of. First is the U and D keystroke. So D actually moves down the log, whereas U moves up the log. The other is H to actually bring up the help information, which will give you, well, a little bit more information about how to navigate these logs, because being a text-based system, well, everything has to be done with keystrokes. And then lastly is the Q command, because Q will leave help, and then Q again will actually leave the log to bring you back to the customization screen. So you can view these logs here. Again, there are all 6 of them available for you to try to figure out what's going on. There is also the ability for you to go into here with the troubleshooting options and enable either the local ESXi shell or the remote shell via SSH. Now, these are both available here, and they are disabled by default. Now, the reason for that is just goes back to the whole applianceness of this operating system. If I go here and click to enable SSH, you'll see here that SSH is now enabled. This opens up an available port and begins listening on the SSH port. It also presents a way for someone to potentially come hack into the system. So if you're not actually making use of SSH, well, it's probably a good idea to leave it disabled so that someone can't come in from somewhere else and try to do something with your systems. Once you do enable SSH, you're going to need some sort of tool with which to actually remotely connect into the ESXi host. Now, one common tool is a cool tool called Putty, or P-U-T-T-Y. If you run Putty, it's a free download right off the internet. It brings up a screen that looks something similar to this. Now, Putty needs to connect to via SSH to 192.168.0.202 here in my environment. If I take a look at this and double click, it'll actually connect me in to this host. Now, just like before, I've got an RSA-2 key fingerprint here that's associated with this host. And if I trust that, I can go ahead and hit the yes key to add it to Putty's cache so I won't actually get this security alert again. If I don't want to, if I hit the no button, it'll actually keep alerting me until I eventually hit yes. Now, you'll see here that I have a Putty connection in here, and if I type in root and then the username or the password associated with root, I can now actually interact with the Linux portion of this ESX server just like I would from any BusyBox Linux instance. So using the ls command and then the cd command to move into various locations, I can work with this operating system just like I would any other kind of Linux operating system. Now, if you're not really comfortable with ducking into the operating system in this way, you probably will want to stay out of SSH because there are other tools with which to be able to assist you. Now, one of the tools that sometimes actually causes a problem is a disconnection between vCenter and the ESXi hosts. This, for some reason, just happens from time to time. Now, virtual machines may be running, but your ability to manage those virtual machines may be impacted. So this Restart Management Agents link down here provides a way for you to disconnect the remote management software and then reconnect it so that you can figure out, well, what happened with that connection between VC and ESXi. A lot of times this Restart Management Agents could be your first line of defense for actually solving a problem that you see. Lastly is this Modify ESXi Shell Timeout element here. This will actually modify the amount of time that your shell logons are automatically disabled. So if you want to put them in here for, I don't know, if I enable the ability to log on to the shell, well, maybe I want to automatically disable that logon after a certain number of minutes. This ensures that if I forget to do that, well, then it's going to go ahead and automatically disable that at some point into the future. By default, it's set to not disable at all. So there is no timeout whatsoever. But if you set a timeout here, this will automatically set it to 60 minutes or 120 minutes or whatever to, again, protect that ESXi host from being hacked after the point at which you're done making use of it. Now, for those of us that don't like to dig into the command line areas of our vCenter environment, we still have the vSphere client. And more often than not, if you're doing troubleshooting, you're probably working with VMware and VMware's troubleshooting support, their technical support group, in figuring out why you're having the problems that you are. Now, many times they may ask you to, for one of the elements here, to actually go ahead and export some diagnostic information that you'll use to give to them so they can figure out what's going on. If you go into the File menu here and Export, you'll see Events and then System Logs, as well as some other things here as well. If you go down here to System Logs, this provides a mechanism for you to actually export the system logs for different hosts or for an entire cluster full of hosts that you would then give to, for example, VMware to help them troubleshoot. You'll see I can include information down here from vCenter Server and from the vSphere client. And then I can select the system logs that I want to send. Well, there's a whole bunch of system logs, as you can see here. Those I can then click a little further to identify if there's even more detail that I want to provide. If there's performance data that they require, I can click this box here to gather the performance data and send that off to them as well. Once I'm done, I need to set a download location for where I want to collect those logs, just somewhere here on this server, and that'll go ahead and create a log bundle that you'll ultimately then probably FTP up to VMware to give them the information they need in assisting you with the whole troubleshooting process. Be aware of this. It will probably be a common process that you'll need to do anytime you're working with VMware and their troubleshooting support. Now, there are a couple of different things I mentioned that were sort of miscellaneous things that hadn't gotten brought up in previous nuggets that I want to bring up here in this troubleshooting nugget because they become useful for some of the troubleshooting activities, specifically as it relates to vMotion and also DRS. Now, vMotion actually down here, if I take a look at any of the virtual machines, if I look at the maps icon here for the virtual machine as opposed to one of the hosts, you'll see that the maps icon actually shows me a little bit of different information here about what this virtual machine is connecting to. Now, this map is not necessarily a map of logical resources that this virtual machine is connecting to. It's that plus more information about the different vMotion capabilities for this virtual machine. Now you'll see VM1 here is currently on ESX2.company.pri because I've got this nice blue linkage here. And I've got the VMware Data Recovery Appliance. If I take a look at its map, it's over here connecting to something else, ESX1.company.pri. So these provide a nice capability for you to identify where your hosts are as well as where they could potentially be when you're looking at all the different virtual machines and all the different hosts in your environment. This just gives you, again, just like with the other maps, a greater ability for you to identify what the interconnections are between the different hosts and virtual machines you have. Now, DRS can, as I said many times before, be somewhat complicated in identifying, well, how exactly is it going about its load balancing? And there is one fairly advanced topic down here that relates to DRS down here at the bottom. DRS, as I said before, is a mechanism for load balancing different virtual machines across the hosts that you have. And it uses a fairly complex mathematical model for identifying how the different virtual machines should get balanced among the hosts that you have. If you're familiar with any of your basic statistics, it makes use of a mean and also a standard deviation from that mean to identify what is an acceptable amount of imbalance for the cluster. What DRS effectively does is every 300 seconds or so, about every 5 minutes or so, it runs a pass on the cluster to identify what the mean use is of resources and then also what the standard deviation is of those resources. And if the target host load standard deviation is less than the current host load standard deviation, well then we've got a problem. What we want to have, as you can see here, is that a current host load standard deviation is actually less than what our target is. And we get the nice green checkbox here that identifies whether or not we're load balanced or not. You can get a little bit more information here about how those resources are being distributed by clicking the View Resource Distribution chart. This gives me a view of, well, okay, here's CPU by percentage of the different hosts that are in this environment. I can take a look at memory here and how much memory is being consumed on a host-by-host basis. This is what DRS is actually using to calculate what the host load standard deviation is. Now, these are some complex names, and admittedly, I've never really liked these names because I think they make things more complex than what they need to be. Or you could almost call this, well, is my cluster balanced or not, and how balanced is my cluster? Now, the current host load standard deviation is an actual real-time number that is gathered by viewing the different resources and their utilization by those virtual machines. So this is going to change every time that the cluster goes about doing a rebalancing activity. The target host load standard deviation, however, is something that you can actually configure on your DRS cluster. If I right-click here and choose Edit Settings and go back in here to vSphere DRS, remember back when we determined whether it was going to be a partially automated or fully automated cluster, and that we had this migration threshold here for setting it between conservative and aggressive? If I move this setting here from one setting to another, I'm actually going to change the target host load standard deviation from one to another. What this does is it says that by increasing the standard deviation, that means I have more tolerance of how imbalanced my cluster can be. So if you want to adjust your cluster to be a little bit more aggressive with its load balancing, you're actually going to go and change this value a bit for how the target and the current host load standard deviation are related to each other. If you find that you're doing your DRS is doing too many load balancing activities or doing too many vMotions in order to accomplish what it needs to, well, then that means you probably might want to go back into your cluster settings and set it to be a little bit more conservative. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about just really some of those basic troubleshooting tasks. And again, I pointed you to that troubleshooting document because it really is your best resource for all of the different types of troubleshooting activities that you need to be aware of. Obviously, maintaining and ensuring that you have the right configurations across all of the different hosts in your environment is absolutely and fundamentally important. But then also understanding how the different configurations interrelate with each other can be useful. And that guide provides a lot of detail for you. And then from there, we went through some of the different troubleshooting functionalities and features that ESXi and vCenter both have for you, both at the ESXi level here with system logs and those troubleshooting mode options, and then also at the vCenter later with this diagnostic information and the packages that you can create and submit to VMware. We then spent a little bit of time here with the DRS resource distribution graph and those target and current host load standard deviation metrics, and then ultimately talked a little bit about those vMotion resource maps because, as I said before, maps are just cool. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.